Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Zeno's paradox. So Zeno of Elea, he was a Greek philosopher and he had a passion for paradoxes. And he defended Parmenides' controversial claims about how the world worked, such as the lack of motion, pluralism, and the absolute lack of change. And Zeno attempted to stump those who critiqued Parmenides by presenting them with unsolvable paradoxes. The first one he presented them with was a race where the runner has to complete the full race, but first they have to complete half the distance. So once they complete half the distance, they can draw a new halfway point from this point to the end, looking like that. Then they'll have to complete this extra halfway point. Now you can keep drawing these halfway points forever, infinitely, and creating an infinite amount of tasks for your runner to complete. Since no finite runner can complete an infinite amount of tasks, no one will be able to complete this. And if you apply the same logic to the beginning of the race, to get halfway done, first they'll have to do halfway of that, halfway of that, halfway of that, and they'll never be able to leave their initial position. So all movement is impossible. He also proposed another race where Achilles would race a tortoise, and the tortoise would get a head start just because of how slow he is. And a stopwatch would be started at the beginning. How long would it take for Achilles to catch up? So you can see Achilles first gets to the position of the tortoise, but the tortoise isn't there anymore. He moved a little bit. Now Achilles has to catch up again, but the tortoise once again has moved a little bit. Achilles can't get to that same spot. So the key takeaways here is that Achilles will never catch up with the tortoise, so the stopwatch will never stop running. The total time of this race will be infinite, and because no human can run for an infinite duration, this is an impossible task. Next, we are talking about the nature of position. So any object must exist in a place, and that place simply is either something or nothing. And so if that place was nothing, then it couldn't contain any objects. So it's fair to say that this place is something. So every object is contained in something. But for that something to be something, it also has to be an object now. So now this something is contained by another something, which is contained by another something, which is contained by another something, until eventually you contain everything in the entire universe. And at that scale, everything outside of your object is nothing by the definition of the universe. Being outside of this box is nothing. So everything is surrounded by nothing, which is equivalent to saying everything exists nowhere. And one of his slightly more confusing ones is his take on plurality. So Zeno set out to prove that there are not many things, but rather there are just one thing. And so first he could assume that, assuming there are many things, there's a finite amount of them. And for two things to be different, instead of just one thing, something must be separating these two things. You'll see that with this bar. Now this bar is also a thing, and so it's in contact with the other box, so it has to be separated again. So you create another thing to separate them, so there's nothing touching. And this process will go on infinitely. And so this logic relies on there being a finite amount of many things, but following the logic, you'll find that it requires an infinite amount of many things. So the logic is contradictory, therefore it's false that there are many things, and so it is true that there is only one thing. Now, you may have sat through this PowerPoint and not been able to believe what you've been told, which is fair. We know motion exists, we know position exists, we know plurality exists, but how do you do it mathematically? This stumped people for thousands of years until finally, in the 17th century, mathematicians invented calculus and could better understand infinity than they ever could before. And they used something called the limit to determine that even though we were kept adding finite values of distance or time, the amount that we were adding was decreasing, so we weren't actually approaching an infinite value, but we were approaching a finite value. So there was no problem with infinity, and all was good in the world. The end.